Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Historical Snapshots Conversations. Our guest today is Yardena Schwartz, author of Ghosts of a Holy War. The book tells the story of the 1929 massacre in Mandatory Palestine and its aftershocks, which continue to reverberate today. For our conversation, we'll focus more specifically on the riot in Hebron, in which 67 Jewish residents were killed and many more injured. A little bit about Yardena. She's an award-winning journalist and Emmy-nominated producer. She has reported for dozens of publications, including the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Time, Economist, New York Review of Books, and Foreign Policy. She has also reported from a number of places worldwide, including Morocco, Nepal, Ukraine, Poland, France, Germany, and the United States. Yardena, welcome. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Roman.
Awesome. So to get started, to set some context, what is Hebron?
So Hebron is the second holiest city in Judaism. It is about a 20-minute drive from Jerusalem. And in 1929, it was part of the British Mandate of Palestine. Today, it is located in the heart of the West Bank. It's the largest Palestinian city in the West Bank. It's also the only Palestinian city in the West Bank that is also home to Israelis. So today it has a population of about 250,000 Arabs and about 800 Jews. And in 1929, the time of the massacre that I write about in the book, was home to about 20,000 Arabs and also a very small community of about 800 Jews. And I mentioned that it's a holy city in Judaism. It's also a holy city in Islam as well, because it is the burial place of Abraham and the patriarchs and matriarchs of the Jewish people. Abraham is considered the father of the Jewish people. And in Islam, he's revered as a prophet. And he's also considered the patriarch of both the Jewish and Arab people.
Got it. So an important city to both.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so then, if we go back to 1929, what is the relationship like between the Jewish and Arab communities there?
So the relationship was one of mostly harmony between the two. Jews and Arabs lived side by side. In fact, many of the Jews who were living in Hebron at the time were renting their homes from Arabs. Many of the Jewish students of the Hebron Yeshiva, which was the most prestigious yeshiva in Palestine at the time, many of them rented their homes from Arab landlords, or they rented rooms in the homes of local Jews who rented their homes from Arabs. And there were businesses that were co-owned and operated by Jewish and Muslim families. But as the minority in Hebron, the Jewish community was in a way inferior to the Muslim population. So the Jews many of them lived in what was known as the ghetto. It was the only place in Palestine that had a ghetto. It had a walled ghetto at night. They closed and locked the doors of the ghetto. Jews were forbidden from entering the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs where the forefathers and mothers of the Jewish people are buried, because after the Muslim conquest of Palestine, that tomb was turned into a mosque. And only Muslims were permitted to enter. So Jews continued to pray at the tomb, but they could only go as far as the seventh step of the entryway to the tomb, which, this was the case for 700 years of Muslim rule until 1967, when Israel conquered Hebron from the Jordanians and ended that restriction. But for 700 years under Muslim rule, only Muslims were permitted to go inside. And so that was one kind of example of the way in which the Jewish community in Hebron was kind of subservient to the Muslim population. That was also the case if you looked at the Hebron City Council. There was just one Jewish man on the city council. His name was Eliezer Dan Slonim. He was the son of the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Hebron. There was a chief Ashkenazi rabbi and a chief Sephardi rabbi, because the population of about 800 Jews was almost equally split between Ashkenazi Jews, so those who had come from Europe, and Sephardi Jews, those who had hailed from either Arab countries or had been expelled from Spain or Italy during the Inquisition. Many of the Jews in Hebron in 1929 actually spoke Arabic, and this was why they had such good relations with their Arab neighbors, and were able to, run businesses together because they spoke Arabic. And the more newly arrived Jews living in Hebron, those who were studying at the yeshiva, one of them was the young man who is kind of the central character in my book. He was among the kind of two dozen American students at the yeshiva, but many of them were also from Europe, from Palestine, or from Arabic-speaking countries.
And just for some more context, what is a yeshiva?
So yeshiva is a place of Jewish learning. It's where students study Torah, or they study the Gemara, different, ancient Jewish texts and writings of rabbinical sages. Some, if not all, not all students who attend a yeshiva are planning to become rabbis, but often it is young men who want to study to become rabbis. In the case of David Schoenberg, the young man who I write about in my book, he did hope to become a rabbi, and many of his friends did as well before they had a tragic ending to their story in Hebron.
In terms of the local governance, it was predominantly by Arab Muslim rule, but the region itself at the time was under British governance. Is that correct?
That's right. So under the British Mandate period, which followed 400 years of rule by the Ottoman Empire in Palestine and also much of the Muslim world, the British government was given the right, the mandate to govern Palestine by the League of Nations, the precursor to the United Nations, after World War I, with the end of the Ottoman Empire. So after World War I, different territories that had been ruled by the Ottoman Empire were divided among the victors in World War I. So that included the British, the French. The British took over Palestine, and it was essentially a British ruled territory where the local population was not governing, was not sovereign. So despite the fact that it was an Arab majority territory in Palestine, it wasn't an Arab country in the sense that it wasn't governed by the local Arab population. It wasn't a sovereign Arab state. It wasn't even technically a state. It was, a British territory, if you will. And at the time, there were, in 1929, about 20% of the population of Palestine was Jewish, and the rest was Arab, both Christian and Muslim. And the British, throughout the Mandate, had struggled with these dual nationalist aspirations of the population they were ruling over. So the Arabs in Palestine wanted independence from the British, the Jews wanted independence from the British, and because of that tension, which was often expressed both against the British themselves and between the Arab and Jewish populations, the British, throughout the Mandate period, which lasted from about 1920 to 1948, when Israel declared independence, the British had tried to resolve this conflict, including through a two-state solution in 1937, which was accepted by the Jewish population and vehemently rejected by the Arab population.
So in 1929 specifically, it sounds like things in Hebron relatively peaceful between the Arab population and the Jewish population. What is the situation like in broader Mandatory Palestine?
So in broader Mandatory Palestine in 1929, there had been years of tension between the Arab majority in Palestine and the Jewish minority, because the Jewish minority was growing as a result of deadly anti-Semitism that was gripping Europe at the time. This was, of course, before the rise of Hitler and the beginning of the Holocaust, but pogroms in which, deadly riots had afflicted various Jewish communities in Europe, led thousands of Jews to flee Eastern Europe. Many of them ended up in the United States, and many of them ended up in British Mandate Palestine, because in 1917, shortly after the Ottoman Empire fell and the British took over Palestine, the British declared their support for the creation of a Jewish home in Palestine. This wasn't to be a Jewish state, but a Jewish home in Palestine, where Jews around the world, mostly in Eastern Europe, could escape the the rampant pogroms and the violent anti-Semitism that they were facing and build new lives in their ancient homeland, in the land of Israel. And so in 1917, the Balfour Declaration expressed the British government's support for the creation of a Jewish home. And when the League of Nations granted the British government the mandate to rule Palestine, the Balfour Declaration and its support for the creation of a Jewish home was built in. It was actually a very fundamental part of that mandate. So it wasn't just giving the British the right to govern Palestine, it was giving them the duty to create this Jewish home, this place of refuge for world Jewry, to rebuild their ancient homeland, because at the time it was home to just 1 million people. Today, Israel is home to 10 million people, just for comparison purposes. At the time, it was home to about 1 million people, including about 200,000 Jews. And over time, after the Balfour Declaration lifted Ottoman-era restrictions on Jewish immigration to Palestine, those numbers swelled. And so there began to be a wave of resentment amongst the native Arab population to the incoming Jewish population from Europe. Of course, it wasn't, the Jewish community of Palestine wasn't all coming from Europe. There had been generations of Jewish families living in Palestine, either those who had remained through years of exile from ancient Israel. Israel had been first conquered by the Babylonians, and that led to the Babylonian exile when Jews went to what is now Iraq, and then later by the Romans. So there are these waves of exile where the Israelites were expelled from the land of Israel, but there had always remained populations of Jews who had remained in first Israel, later was renamed Palestine by the Romans. But, they had been a minority in what had long been a Muslim land under the Ottomans. And so when the British ended these restrictions on Jewish immigration and the local Arab population saw, the immigration of Jewish Europeans coming to Palestine, there was a lot of resentment against that immigration. That's nothing new to people listening in 2024, hearing so many politicians rail against immigrants bringing, different kind of ways of living and different kind of values. And so that was the backdrop for a lot of this tension. It was, Arab leaders in Palestine doing a lot of fear mongering and telling their people that these Jewish immigrants were bringing values that were antithetical to the local way of life. And in a way, they were right. I mean, many of the Jewish immigrants were coming from places where, there was a lot of equality between religions. There was more equality between men and women. Of course, this was the 1920s. We're not talking about total equality between men and women, but for a very patriarchal society that existed in Palestine among the Arab population, where women were not to be seen if they weren't with their husbands, where women were completely veiled. To see these European women coming and wearing dresses or shorts and working in the farms, in the fields with their husbands and brothers and sons, that was very different from what the local Arab population had been accustomed to. And there was a lot of antagonism between the local Arab population and these Jewish immigrants. And so that was kind of the backdrop to the riots that began in 1929, but that wasn't the only backdrop. There was also this campaign of incitement and disinformation that the leader of Palestinian Muslims under British rule began in 1928, which was centered on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the third holiest site in Islam. It was built atop the ruins of the two ancient Jewish temples that were destroyed in ancient times. And what he did was he began this propaganda campaign. And when I say he, I'm talking about Grand Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini, the leader of Palestinian Muslims under British rule. He was appointed by the British to his role when he began to face widespread opposition and criticism for corruption and nepotism and misuse of religious funds. What he did was work to distract from that criticism by creating this disinformation campaign, which was very successful. And it was based on a lie that the Jews of Palestine were planning to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque to rebuild their ancient temple. And that propaganda campaign led ultimately 1 year later to the outbreak of deadly riots, which reached their climax in Hebron on August 20, 1929.
How does the riot start and what happens?
So it started on August 23rd, 1929, after Friday prayers at Al-Aqsa Mosque, where imams who had been appointed by the Grand Mufti, because the Grand Mufti was not just the equivalent of the chief rabbi of Palestine. He was, the most important Muslim leader in Palestine, but he was also the head of the Supreme Muslim Council, which oversaw all Muslim holy sites, all Sharia courts in Palestine. He was in charge of. So he appointed the imams, the clerics, and they carried out this propaganda campaign throughout that year. And on August 23rd, 1929, they called on the faithful to defend Islam with their blood and to protect Al-Aqsa from this supposed Jewish plot to destroy it. And they went on to attack Jewish passersby in Jerusalem, to set fire to Jewish businesses, and the riots just ricocheted throughout Palestine that day. So they spread from Jerusalem to all the surrounding villages. They ended up reaching every Jewish community in Palestine, and the British ended up having to evacuate Jewish communities from Gaza, from different, farming villages in the north and the south. And when they reached Hebron that day on August 23rd, 1929, the Jewish community in Hebron was taken by surprise. Despite the fact they had been warned that these riots would reach them, they had refused to believe that. They didn't think that their friends and neighbors and coworkers would hurt them. And in fact, 2 days before the riots erupted, a contingent of the Haganah, the underground Jewish defense force that would later become the IDF, they had visited Hebron and warned Jewish leaders in Hebron that these riots were going to erupt. They didn't know exactly when, but they knew something was going to happen. They sensed that something was being planned. They knew it was going to start in Jerusalem, and they sensed that it would reach Hebron. And the Jewish leaders of Hebron were unanimous in their opposition to receiving help from the Haganah. They said, our Arab neighbors are friends. They won't hurt us. If anything happens here, they'll protect us. And they said that if their Arab neighbors see strange men they've never known armed, that's actually only going to make things worse. That the presence of the Haganah would actually serve as a provocation. So they said, get out of here. And they did. The Haganah left. And the reason why Hebron became the epicenter of the riots and the place where more Jews were killed than anywhere else, and with more brutality than anywhere else, was because in other places, the Haganah was there to protect them and was there to defend them. And in some parts, there were pitched battles between Arab mobs and Haganah defense forces. And that was what happened in Jerusalem. And that's not what happened in Hebron. In Hebron, the Jewish community was absolutely defenseless. No one was armed. And 67 Jewish men, women, and children ended up being brutally slaughtered. The first person who was killed, it was on the very day that the riots had erupted in Jerusalem. A young Jewish student at the Hebron Yeshiva was murdered on August 23rd, 1929. And that night, all of the Jewish families were huddled in their homes, waiting in fear, not knowing what would come the next day. And the British police chief, who oversaw a force of about 40 policemen in Hebron, all of them were Arabs except for one, he had told the Jews to just stay in their homes. And he said that, as long as you stay in your homes, you'll be safe. Don't leave your homes. And so they listened to him. And in one home, the home of Eliezer Dan Slonim, the man who I mentioned earlier, who was the only Jewish man on Hebron City Council, he was kind of seen as, a pillar of the Jewish community. He had many Arabic friends. He spoke Arabic. He was the head of the Hebron branch of the Anglo-Palestine Bank. And he had many friends among the Arab leadership in Hebron. His friends had promised to protect him. And on the morning of August 24th, 1929, there were 70 people hiding out in his home because it was seen as, the safest place to be in Hebron, because everyone was sure that no one would hurt this man who had so many friends in the Arab community. And his friends had actually sat outside his door that morning promising to protect him if mobs came to his home. And by the time the mob reached his home, those friends were nowhere to be found. And in fact, when rioters broke into his home and began to slaughter as many people as they could, he saw one of his friends in that mob and cried out. One of his last words were "friend," asking, how could he do this to them? And Eliezer, his wife, their 5-year-old son were all slaughtered, along with about 20 other people inside his home that day. And his 11-month-old son was also almost killed, but one of the survivors found him barely breathing in the arms of his mother, who had also been raped before she was killed. And, the atrocities committed in Hebron that day were just horrific. And, the Hannah Slonim, Eliezer's wife, wasn't the only one to be raped. The teenage girls were raped before they were killed. Elderly rabbis and yeshiva students were castrated. Some people were burnt alive. Entire families were butchered by their neighbors. And all told, 67 Jewish men, women, and children were murdered that day by their neighbors. The numbers were really shocking because, maybe in today's terms, that doesn't sound like a lot of people, but for a small community of 800 people who weren't, these weren't Zionists building the foundations of a Jewish state on their backs. These were pious Jews living a quiet existence centered around the study of the Hebrew Bible. Their lives centered around Shabbat and Jewish holidays. They were friends with their Arab neighbors. When they celebrated Jewish and Muslim holidays, they celebrated them often together. When there were weddings, you would see Muslims and Jews dancing side by side at these weddings. And that was shattered by this massacre because out of 20,000 Muslim residents of Hebron, 3,000 Muslims participated in the massacre. And that was just the men who participated. Their wives and children were often following them. And then after their slaughter was finished, they would go inside the homes and take whatever they could. So, in the aftermath of the massacre, these homes were burnt to the ground. Anything of value had been taken. And thankfully, there were Arabs who did not participate. There were about 24 Arab families who risked their own lives to save their Jewish neighbors. And out of the 500 Jews who survived that day, because there were also Jews who weren't home because it was the middle of the summer. Many of them were vacationing that weekend or that Shabbat in Jerusalem, or they just for whatever reason weren't there that weekend. So 500 Jews were there that weekend out of the 800 who lived there. 200 who survived only survived because their Arab neighbors saved them by hiding them in their homes or standing outside their homes and not allowing the mobs to enter their homes. And then others who survived only survived because they were hiding beneath the dead bodies of their loved ones or their friends and their neighbors. And they were assumed to be dead because they were covered in blood.
And so the British officials had given the order to stay home. Was there any other response from the police force and the governance?
So what's interesting is that the British police chief of Hebron, Raymond Kafarada, he had also been warned, not by the Haganah, but by local Arab leaders who said they had received letters from the Grand Mufti calling on the people in their villages to take revenge against the Jews and to defend Islam and Al-Aqsa from this Jewish plot. And they came to him saying, we don't know what to do. They wanted to let him know what was happening. And he waited until the day the massacre began. He waited until then to call for reinforcements from Jerusalem and Gaza, from other, police stations. And at that point, the riots had already taken over the entire land of Palestine, so they couldn't send reinforcements. And what he did was he had taken the guns away from his policemen because he was afraid they would use them against the Jewish population. And because all of the policemen, except for one, were Arabs, many of them either stood by and, these were their family members. These were their friends. They, just stood by and allowed it to happen. And in some cases, they actively participated in the massacre. There was maybe one or two testimonies I found in which survivors testified that an Arab policeman had tried to help them and had actually saved them. But in most cases, there were testimonies that the Arab policemen were actually among the rioters in their homes or outside their homes, kind of standing guard. And what happened on August 24th, 1929, was that all of this horror took place over the course of just 2 hours that morning, that Sabbath morning. And what ended it was when Raymond Cafarata finally felt that his own life was in danger, and he fired the first shot that was fired that day, and the crowds dispersed and ran away, and the riot essentially ended as soon as he fired his gun. But he only did so once his own life was in danger. Until then, the slaughter had really just, and the riots had really just targeted the Jews of Hebron. And if he had fired his gun earlier that day, who knows how many people would have been saved.
So how is this reported within Palestine and internationally?
So it's really interesting because the British actually enforced a censorship of both Hebrew language reporting and Arabic reporting within Palestine. So there were no news reports for a week in Palestine, but there had been foreign correspondents based in Palestine for various newspapers, British newspapers, American newspapers. The Jewish Telegraphic Agency based in New York had correspondents in Palestine. And, it was really interesting because I could find newspaper reports from the New York Times and from JTA from August 26, 1929, but nothing from the Palestine Post and different Arabic newspapers. Thankfully, they were only able to censor the presses, the newspaper presses that were in Palestine. But in the New York Times, for example, the front page of the New York Times in the immediate aftermath of the massacre, for days after the massacre, the front page was occupied by reports from Palestine of Arab mobs slaughtering Jews across Palestine, of American yeshiva students among the slain young men in Hebron. And there was really, wall-to-wall coverage in American newspapers, not just the New York Times, in cities across America. This was front page news for about a week because the riots didn't end that day. They continued for a solid week. And even after that, there were, terrorist attacks against Jews in various parts of Palestine. But the riots themselves kind of died down after about a week, only because the British brought in warplanes and warships from across the British Empire. And that was also part of the coverage in newspapers around the world, the British response to it. There was no criticism of this, massive British onslaught against the local Arabs who were carrying out these attacks against, unarmed Jewish communities, unprovoked, completely unprovoked. But what was interesting was to see how in some newspaper reports, the attacks against the Jewish community were sometimes depicted as clashes between the local Arabs and Jews. When you would see the headline, it said, clashes between Arabs and Jews, but then you'd read the article and it was clear these weren't clashes. These were attacks by Arab rioters or Arabs on horseback attacking Jewish communities, outlying Jewish farming communities, completely unprovoked. And so there was a lot of echoes to the coverage today, because in 1929, there was, in the same way as there is today, this kind of ignorance of the context, ignorance of the history. There was very little reporting on the incitement campaign that had led to the riots. There was this kind of sense, if you read the stories, as if this kind of broke out of nowhere. And yet, to anyone who had been following, the disinformation campaign and the incitement, it was very clear that it didn't happen out of nowhere. And after the riots died down, the British called on this commission from London to come to Palestine to investigate the causes of the riots. And that commission did find that what had led to the riots was this campaign of propaganda about Jewish prayer at the Western Wall, and that, Jews praying at the Western Wall were really planning to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque to rebuild the temple. And yet, despite the fact that the commission made that very clear in hundreds of hours of testimony of, Jewish survivors, British officials, the Grand Mufti, Haj Amin Hosseini, in the end, the commission found that the Mufti could retain his post, kind of pardoned him for his incitement campaign, and instead blamed the riots on this peaceful Jewish demonstration at the Western Wall, which had been a protest against the British for their failure to act against this campaign of propaganda and this campaign to restrict Jewish access at the Western Wall. And what happened before the riots, what happened with this demonstration at the Western Wall, was that the Arab leaders in Palestine and the Arabic press had depicted this peaceful demonstration as anything but peaceful. In the Arabic press and in statements by Arab leaders, they had falsely claimed that these Jewish demonstrators had cursed the Prophet Muhammad, which is a very serious allegation in the Muslim world, that they claimed they had not only cursed the Prophet Muhammad, but that they had attacked Muslims near the Western Wall, that they had raped Muslim women. None of that was true. And that was made very clear in the commission, the Shah Commission, that investigated these riots. And yet at the same time, the commission found that, this Jewish demonstration calling for Jewish freedom of worship at the Western Wall had provoked the Arab masses and had provoked their anger and their frustration over Jewish immigration. And so after this commission came out with its conclusions, the British actually came out with a new policy vastly limiting Jewish immigration and Jewish land purchases in Palestine. Because at the time, despite much of the propaganda we hear today about Jews stealing land in Palestine, none of that land was stolen. It was purchased by Jews in Palestine from Arab landowners, who many of them were absentee landowners. The reaction to the Arab riots were actually very similar to the reaction today to October 7th. I mean, the British responded with this, by quelling the riots with military force. They then essentially blamed the Jewish victims for what had happened to them. And so did the Arab leadership. The Arab leadership didn't just deny that atrocities had taken place in Hebron. They also blamed the Jewish victims for the massacre, and not in the same way that the British blamed them. The British, indirectly blamed them by saying that, Jewish immigration had led to this legitimate fear among the Arab population. In Hebron, Arab leaders claimed that it was Jewish yeshiva students who had killed Jews in order to raise funds from the Jewish diaspora. So the level of victim blaming was, it was another level. And it was very similar to a lot of the victim blaming we saw after October 7th.
So what impact does this have on the Jewish community in Hebron post?
So first of all, the Jewish community of Hebron was entirely evacuated by British forces and told not to return. So this community that had been one of the most ancient Jewish communities in the world until 1929 and had existed for thousands of years ceased to exist. 1 year after the massacre, about 90 Jews returned to live there, but it wasn't, you couldn't call it a Jewish community. It was, just kind of individuals trying to make a life there, because that was all they had known. And they were later, again, evacuated by the British in 1936 when another riot erupted. But the Jewish community of Hebron essentially ceased to exist in 1929 with this massacre, and so did hope for coexistence, because Hebron had really been a symbol of peaceful coexistence in Palestine. It was seen as the safest place for Jews in Palestine, a place where Arabs and Jews had lived side by side for centuries. Also, it ended a lot of the antagonism against Zionism that had existed within the Jewish population of Palestine before 1929. So I mentioned earlier that the Jewish community of Hebron they were not Zionists. They were pious Jews. They were anti-Zionists. They saw, many of them, not all of them, but many of them saw Zionism as a secular contamination of Judaism. because it was led by secular Jews. And so many of the traditional Jews living in Palestine, many of the Sephardi Jews living in Palestine, who saw Zionism as not just a secular movement, but also as a European movement because it had begun in Europe, they rejected Zionism. They did not embrace it. And so before 1929, Zionism was not this kind of unifying force within the Jewish community of Palestine and not in the Jewish diaspora as well. That began to change after 1929 because the Jewish community in Palestine recognized that they would not be safe under a foreign power, that, the British had not just failed to protect them in 1929, but had openly betrayed them. I mean, they had done nothing to silence this propaganda and disinformation campaign. They had stood by as Jews were slaughtered before their eyes, not just in Hebron, but elsewhere. And so many of the Jews who had until then opposed Zionism came to embrace it because they saw that they could only be safe under the protection of their own army and in their own country. And so, until 1929, many of the Zionist leaders in Palestine had been open to and not just open to, but favoring kind of like a binational state in Palestine, and not a Jewish state, but rather a Jewish home. And the calls for a Jewish state with a Jewish majority, that really began to accelerate after 1929.
And is that how Zionism was defined at the time?
Sorry, how Zionism was defined at the time?
So the word Zionism is often used. How was it defined at the time? How did people think of what was Zionism in the late 1920s?
That's a great question. So Zionism was established as a movement for the self-determination of the Jewish people, because until then, and at that point, Jews had only existed as weak minorities anywhere they lived. They were not just minorities, but they were treated as unwanted strangers wherever they lived. So whether it was in Europe, in America, there was no country where the Jews were a majority, and certainly no country where Jews were the leaders of a state or deciding their own destiny. So what emerged with the creation of Zionism was a movement to create Jewish self-determination, where Jews could decide their own destiny in their own land. And in the beginning, it wasn't seen as the creation of a state. This was at a time when states weren't really a concept, it was a concept, but not all entities were states. There were this idea of a Jewish home. It originally an idea of creating a Jewish state governed by Jews. It was a place where Jews could be safe from the religious persecution they had endured wherever they had lived. And so the idea of Jewish self-determination eventually kind of turned into a quest for a Jewish state with a Jewish majority, Jewish leadership, where that self-determination could really be realized. And the antagonism against Zionism had meant that until 1929, entities like the Haganah, the underground Jewish militia that would later become the IDF, it was an entirely Ashkenazi operation. Sephardi Jews, traditional Jews who really despised the Zionist movement because they saw it as this, secular movement. After 1929, the Haganah was joined by many Sephardic Jews. So these were, the Arabic-speaking Jews who had kind of, before 1929, seen themselves as having more in common with their Arab neighbors than their, European Jewish neighbors, now realized that, to the Arabs, even the Arabic-speaking Jews were seen as, an enemy. And so the Haganah became a much more powerful and much more centralized force after 1929 because of its failure to protect so many Jews in the riots of 1929 and because of the British failure to protect their Jewish subjects. The Jews realized that they needed their own army. They could only rely on themselves to protect themselves. And what also happened after 1929 was that the Haganah itself then splintered into different militias because the Haganah remained a defensive force and a exclusively defensive force that would only protect Jewish communities if there was an Arab attack. And because of what happened in 1929, there was disagreement within the ranks of the Haganah that there should be an actual, proactive force, that if they know that there is going to be going to be an attack, then they should preempt that attack by attacking the forces that are planning to attack them. So this led to the creation of Etzel and, later other different groups that would go on to mainly direct their battles against the British to evict the British from Palestine in order to achieve independence.
So, significant impacts for the Jewish community. Are there impacts to the Arab community post the massacre?
So actually, that's a really interesting question, because contrary to what you would imagine, the Grand Mufti actually became even more powerful after 1929. So he not only retained the post that the British had appointed him to, but he became recognized as the most powerful Arab leader in Palestine. And he began a campaign of retaliation and intimidation, and in some cases assassination, against not only those who opposed his rule and criticized his rule, but those who sought to coexist with the Jewish community. So there were many Arab leaders at the time. Many of them were mayors of Arab towns who sought cooperation with Jewish leaders or with, the Zionist community. And many of them lost their lives as a result of the Mufti's efforts to maintain his own power and make sure that there was no, effort to override his decisions. And his decisions were very clear. He opposed not just Jewish immigration, but any Jewish existence in Palestine. So there were various cases where the British sought to appease him by, further limiting Jewish immigration. And he always rejected their proposals, saying that, he wouldn't countenance a single Jew in Palestine. When the British sought to bring about some kind of resolution of not just the conflict, but bring about an end to their rule in Palestine, and they proposed the first two-state solution in the form of the Peel Proposal of 1937, he was very clear that they asked him, what do you think should happen to the 400,000 Jews now living in Palestine? And he said that they would have to leave. So he didn't just reject a two-state solution. He even rejected a one-state solution of, a binational state. He wanted it to be a purely Muslim country.
So, what lessons are there?
Sorry, so I didn't really answer your question of what happened. How did it affect the Arab population? So, it didn't really. There were, in the immediate aftermath of the riots, the British arrested thousands of Arabs for their participation in the riots. But in the end, only about 25 were convicted and sentenced to either prison terms or sentenced to death, because the death penalty was in use at that time. And all of those convictions were overturned into, minor prison terms, except for 3 men who were hanged by the British in Akko prison. And those men became honored as the first martyrs of the Palestinian cause. They were celebrated as heroes among the Arab population of Palestine in 1929, and kind of commemorated in poems and anthems. And to this day, Palestinian Martyrs' Day is honored on the day that those men were hung. And they continue to be honored in Palestinian curriculum and by Arab political parties, including the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas. The Grand Mufti is still, kind of celebrated as a hero of the Palestinian people. And sadly, the British continued to try to appease these waves of terror, first, with the Shah Commission that pardoned the Mufti and blamed the Jewish demonstration at the Western Wall, and then, limited Jewish immigration. Where in later waves of riots, the British further limited Jewish immigration, and still the Arab leadership rejected those efforts. And even with the Holocaust well underway in Europe, the British essentially ended all Jewish immigration to Palestine. And when thousands of Jewish refugees illegally arrived on Palestine's shores, the British sent them back to Europe or sent them to internment camps in Palestine and in Cyprus. So in 1948, when Israel declared independence, the day that the British left Palestine, there were still 60,000 Jews in these British internment camps who then had to kind of find a way into the land of Israel.
So what are the lessons to draw from the 1929 Hebron Massacre?
I think there are several lessons to draw. One is that disinformation and the power of disinformation are nothing new. We often think of disinformation as a plague of, modern times and social media, but disinformation was absolutely the driving force of those riots in 1929 that led to so much death and destruction. And sadly, we see that disinformation, though it is, a time-old problem, we still lack the tools with which to not just confront it, but extinguish it and limit its power. It's still just as destructive today as it was then. And, the weaponization of Islam is sadly still a driving force of this conflict. I mean, the disinformation campaign in 1929 centered around Al-Aqsa, and Hamas has perpetuated those same lies around Al-Aqsa. I mean, Israel is now in control of the land upon which Al-Aqsa stands. And yet every day, thousands of Muslims pray there. And still, Hamas perpetuates this lie that Israel is working to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque. And this is why on October 7th, you saw Hamas name its attack the Al-Aqsa Flood to liberate Al-Aqsa from the Jews. And this is still kind of a very, very much a rallying cry, not just in Palestinian society, but across the Arab world. This idea that Al-Aqsa is being occupied and needs to be liberated from Jewish hands. And so you see how this disinformation and incitement campaign has lasted a century, and yet we still have not found a way to respond to it and to weaken it and to end it. And countless lives have been lost to this disinformation and incitement. So I think that's one lesson, that disinformation really needs to be addressed, not just everywhere, of course, but especially here in this conflict, since it's really just such a primary factor in perpetuating it. And another lesson is that the idea that you can end terrorism by appeasing it and rewarding it is just so short-sighted and so contrary to the facts of history. I mean, in 1929, when this massacre and the riots it was a part of were met by limits on Jewish immigration, which lasted throughout the Holocaust, that didn't put an end to terrorism. That didn't put an end to, this rejection of peace. It accelerated it. I mean, the violent rejection of peace and a shared future in the land of Palestine, which is now Israel, has lasted a century. And every single wave of terrorism and every wave of uprising and violent rejection of peace has only pushed the supposed goal of independence for Palestine further into the distance. I mean, the massacre of 1929 only strengthened Zionism. The massacre of 1929 only convinced the Jews of Palestine that they wouldn't be able to live in peaceful harmony with their Arab neighbors as they had hoped. And similarly, on October 7th, most of the people who were killed or kidnapped were, left-wing Israelis, peace activists, people who had really hoped for a peaceful future with the Palestinians. And those hopes were largely extinguished on October 7th. And, I think that the lesson here for anyone who wants peace is that the people who are preventing any kind of peaceful life, not just for Israelis, but mostly for Palestinians, are groups like Hamas, who are only interested in more violence and more destruction. And I think that it's a really just tragic reality we're in which people who perceive themselves to be anti-war or, pro-peace are standing on the side of people who are solely responsible for the perpetuation of this conflict through their own rejection of peace. I mean, Hamas hasn't just perpetuated the lies that fuel this conflict, but they have rejected every single peace effort. Not, that the peace effort was offered to them. They were offered to Palestinian leaders, and Hamas worked to derail those peace negotiations. So, from the beginning of the negotiations in Oslo, Hamas was outspokenly against the Oslo peace accords, and they did everything they could to make sure that they didn't succeed, whether it was through bus bombings, suicide bombings, and attacks against Israelis throughout the Oslo Accords. That was the case also with the Second Intifada, also known as the Al-Aqsa Intifada, also sparked by this disinformation campaign around Al-Aqsa. And, it wasn't just Hamas that was carrying out those suicide bombings. It was also the armed wing of Fatah, the political party that is now led by Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. So I think that, the lesson here should be that this violent rejection of peace has gotten the Palestinian people nowhere. It's only made the prospect of a Palestinian state less and less feasible, sadly. It's also convinced most Israelis that there really is no hope for peace, because if the idea of a two-state solution is to relinquish territory and hand it over to the Palestinians, Israelis just look at what happened when Israel left Gaza in 2005 and Hamas took over and turned it into the terror state that it clearly is today. And so I think that anybody hoping for peace needs to recognize that Hamas and every other group that is perpetuating this conflict needs to get out of the way for people who really do want peace.
Very, very important lessons. Yardena, do you feel like we missed anything in this conversation? Anything that we didn't cover that you feel like we should be talking about when it comes to the 1929 Hebron Massacre?
I think that one element of this history that is so unknown, I myself did not know this until I embarked on the research for my book. And I mean, I don't know everything about this conflict, but I mean, I had worked as a journalist in Israel for 10 years. I studied this conflict in university. I took many classes on the history of the conflict and history of Islam and the politics of the conflict. And I had never known until researching this book how destructive a role the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, played, not only in Palestine, but during the Holocaust. I mean, he was not just a Nazi accomplice, but a Nazi. I mean, he lived out the entire years of World War II in a Nazi-financed estate in Berlin. He was the leader of the Arab branch of Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. He met with Hitler and urged him to exterminate the Jews of Palestine. He worked to convince many European leaders to prevent Jewish refugees from fleeing Europe and ending up in Palestine. He urged them to send their Jewish populations to Poland, where he knew very well what was happening in Poland. He had toured concentration camps. The Grand Mufti was actually wanted for Nazi war crimes. He was listed as a Nazi war criminal by the United Nations, and yet he lived out his life in the open. He didn't, like many Nazi officials after World War II, unlike many Nazi officials after World War II, he didn't take on some other name and live his life out in hiding. He lived out in the open. And after World War II, he left Berlin and moved to Cairo and then Beirut, where he launched a jihad against the Jews of Palestine and led that jihad. And he trained his young cousin Yasser Arafat to take over after, he became too old to lead the Palestinian people. And Arafat continued to carry out his legacy and, thanked the Mufti several times for his mentorship. And it's really shocking to me that despite his role in the Holocaust and his unabashed support for the Nazi regime and his role during the Holocaust, his leadership has not been, this stain on the Palestinian cause. He has not been kind of disowned by Palestinian leadership, and the opposite. He's often honored every year as, kind of a hero of the Palestinian cause, whether it's on Palestinian Martyrs Day or on the day that the Mufti died. His memory is often remembered as one of glory for the Palestinian people. And I think that, I was really surprised that I was learning this for the first time when I was writing this book. And I think that I still don't understand why it's such an unknown chapter in history.
Maybe a chapter that needs more attention then. So, but thank you for bringing this sad but important topic to the public, for writing your book, and really appreciate you coming on the podcast to talk about it.
Thank you so much, Roman. It was such a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you for listening to this podcast episode. If you enjoyed, please consider subscribing to Historical Snapshots on Substack, or like and follow wherever you listen to the podcast.